Hello, my Old Testament intro students. This is going to be a video about the book of Genesis. You're doing your homework, your assignment now. So I'm going to try to talk through some of the bigger issues. If you look on the module, I've set up a couple of files for you to look at. It contains more information about the specific stuff in Genesis than I can go over in a video. The textbook itself is just giving you some basic overarching information, which is good, but in an Old Testament intro class, the important thing is, I think, to understand some of the more specifics of the Old Testament. And so what I'm going to try to do in this video is give you as much as possible in about a half hour some big picture items over what we're looking at. Genesis itself basically is broken up into two parts. Genesis 1 through 11 is its own literary unit. It goes from the creation account up through Babel. That's Genesis 1 through 11. Now in your assignment, one of the questions kind of got to the point where the Pentateuch is in two different parts, Genesis 1 through 11 and everything else. And yeah, that's true. But in terms of Genesis, Genesis specifically, we're talking Genesis 1 through 11, Genesis 12 through 50. 12 through 50 covers the patriarchs. There's a cycle of stories on Abraham. There's a cycle of stories on Jacob, and there's a cycle of stories on Joseph. Isaac is kind of in the background all the time, but he doesn't get his own cycle of chapters. So that's what we're looking at in Genesis. Now again, because it's a video and it's not an in-class class, it's hard to have a discussion on this, so I'm just going to jump right into it, and hopefully you could look at the files and stuff. But basically, when it gets right down to it, Genesis 1 through 11 is a different kind of literature than Genesis 12 through 50. The patriarchal narratives, different than Genesis 1 through 11. And basically, when it gets right down to it, Genesis 1 through 11 is not historical narrative. It's narrative, obviously, it's stories. But it is more of mythological narrative. Now that word scares a lot of people, so I'm going to try to unpack it fairly quickly. What it does not mean is fairy tale, fiction, etc., etc. That's colloquialism that we use if we think something isn't true. We say that's a myth. That's technically the wrong way to use the word. We're using it in the specific academic genre term. It's a specific genre of literature that we just aren't familiar with in the modern age because we don't use it. But basically, in the ancient world, when any ancient culture, whether ancient Near East or Greece or Rome, their mythology wasn't trying to do history. It was about what they believed about the gods and about the natural order and about humanity, what the nature of all that is. They're not trying to do history. Nobody thinks, well, it might be overstated, but you get the idea. Myths weren't taken in a strict historical fashion. They were to lay the groundwork for a society's worldview. That's what their purpose is. And every society has a certain kind of founding story like that. Now, the same goes for the ancient Hebrews. Ancient Israel was a part of the ancient Near East. We shouldn't expect it to be that different into how it presents its beliefs. The difference, as we'll see, is whereas in the pagan worldviews of the ancient Near East, their basic views could be summed up with this. They had many gods, and those gods were dangerous and violent and mean. That the reason why you sacrificed to them wasn't because you loved them, it's because you were scared of them. So, the ancient world, they had many gods. They viewed the created order as kind of the corpse of a loser god in one of their myths. Okay? And then when it comes to human beings, the majority of human beings were worthless. They basically viewed things as the only thing that was important is the gods. They used myth to talk about the gods. Their kings, which were believed to be descendants of the gods, So they would record the annals and the victories of those kings. But for the mass of humanity, they didn't write anything. They didn't believe in writing history because history wasn't worth it. Okay? And so basically, they believed in many gods, violent gods. The created order was a mess and dangerous and a corpse of a loser god. And humanity was believed to be, they were created to be slaves to the gods. They were, in some stories, they were created out of the excrement of a dead god or the blood of a dead god. But that was how they viewed things. The gods, crazy. The natural order, chaotic and dangerous and bad. And human beings as slaves. Now, and that sets up their worldview. That's why they didn't write history, because that's all there was. What you see in Genesis 1 through 11, though, is very different. Genesis 1 through 11 starts, it uses that genre to explain what the Hebrews believed about God, nature, and human beings. But they do it in such a way that it's so different that you can almost say that Genesis 1 through 11 is mythological literature, but it's a polemic against the standard worldview of pagan mythology. It kind of takes, it uses that genre to subvert that genre, if you know what I mean. So all that being said, it's not to be taken as giving historical facts. It's painting a picture of who God is, who human beings are, and what our state in the world is. And that sets the stage for understanding history. Okay? And the history, as far as the biblical Bible is concerned, really starts with Abraham in Genesis 12. Now, with that said, if you look on the files, you have the first page is kind of a chart. It's called the Genesis 1 through 11 flow chart. I'm going to take you through this very fast. What it attempts to show you is how Genesis 1 through 11 is laid out as a literary unit. And basically, if you want to print it off, and at the very top, right above the creation box, draw little waves, like symbolizing the waves of the Sea of Chaos, because Genesis 1 begins with, when God began to create the heavens and earth, darkness was on the face of the deep. So the very pictures, before God creates, you have pictures of darkness and the Sea of Chaos. Okay, it's not the Mediterranean Sea, it's just this primeval Sea of Chaos, which most myths have. And then God creates out of that, okay? So you draw waves there, and then draw waves right around the flood. And what you're going to see is the events from Genesis 1 all the way up to Genesis 6 through 4, there's a certain pattern. And then Genesis 6 through 8, the flood, is kind of a wiping the slate clean, getting things back to square one. And then you can see from that point on, from after the flood all the way through the Tower of Babel, there's a same pattern going on. And if you decipher this, you'll kind of have a better idea of what these first 11 chapters are trying to convey. So with that, let's walk through everything very fast. All right, Genesis 1. I just kind of gave away the primary purpose of Genesis 1. If you were a person living in the ancient Near East and you came across Genesis 1, you would not be thinking, wow, this really refutes modern science and Darwinism, because you're not thinking that way. What would stand out for you in Genesis 1, basically three things. There's one God, not many, and that God is good. Number two, that the created order is not chaotic and dangerous in the course of a loser God. Rather, creation is good and orderly. And in fact, the second page, you can kind of see this, the way the 6 days of creation are laid out in a very orderly fashion. Days 1 through 3, you can think of those as like the spheres of existence, the boxes. Light, darkness, the firmament, the waters above, the waters below. That gets to how they viewed cosmology. We'll get to that in a second. But think of it as the air and the sea. And then day 3 is the land. Day 4 corresponds with day 1. Lights govern the light and the darkness. Day 5 correlates with day 2. Fish and sea creatures. And day 6, land animals and people correspond with day 3. The very telling of the creation account is a very orderly account. And almost after every day, God says it was good or it was very good. So right there, that's another theological worldview that is very different. So there's one God, he's good, not many crazy gods. Creation is good and orderly, not a chaotic mess in the corpse of a loser god. And the third thing has to do with human beings. Human beings are created in God's image. Now, what that means is that human beings have inherent dignity and worth. They are to represent that good God in his creation. They are to rule his creation as his representatives. They're kind of kings, if you will. That's what Genesis 1 is getting at, which is very unlike the pagan worldview. In the pagan worldview, human beings were slaves to the gods who had no dignity. They're worthless. Here, right from the beginning, human beings, man, created in God's image. Therefore, he has inherent dignity and worth. He is created to be the ruler of God's creation. That's good. Now, after that, in Genesis 2, you have the story of... well, by the way, the second thing you'll see on the file is the cosmology of the ancient Near East. Basically, those pictures represent the visual of how the ancients viewed the world. Not just Israelites, just everybody in the ancient world. They didn't have telescopes, they didn't have satellites, they had no clue that the earth was a blue round ball floating in space. What they viewed the universe as was you had heaven, and then you had the dome of the sky, the earth was the land, and then the earth rested on subterranean pillars or mountains that came out of the sea. So therefore, they had like a 3-tier system: heaven, earth, and Sheol. Okay, and so therefore, that's what they're working with here in Genesis 1. Now, having said that, moving on to chapter 2 is the story of Eden. Again, we tend to think Eden, if you grew up going to Sunday school, Eden was like a lush Amazon jungle kind of thing. That is not what the ancients would have thought. They would have viewed Eden as the mountain of God that raises up out of the sea, and he's the ruler. And on that mountain, there is a garden. It's not an Amazon jungle. Think of more of like a royal walled-off garden. If you ever go to England or Europe, you see these castles, and they have these immensely royal gardens around the castle. That is how they viewed Eden. So God is the king of his creation, and in his royal estate, he creates human beings to not only rule over his creation, but also act as custodians and caretakers of his estate. Okay? Now, that is what you get in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is what we know as the fall. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 50 chapters this slow. Just these first few, because they're really key. What we call the fall is kind of misleading, because what you see with Adam and Eve, when they're created, we're told that they are naked and they're not ashamed. And the early church fathers talk about this. Jewish scholars talk about this. Adam and Eve are presented as naive, childlike creatures still. They're created in God's image, but they're not yet fully mature. They're not fully like God. They're not God, obviously, but not like God. But they're in his image. And therefore, the purpose of their lives is to grow in relationship with God and become more like God, while still being human beings. The way to be a true human being is to worship the true God, and therefore you become like what you worship. The problem in chapter 3 is that they get deceived, and they eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they're not supposed to. And because of that, they sin, they bring death, and they get banished. Now, we can't go through all that specifics, but here's the point. That whole story gives you kind of another part of what they believed about human beings. On one hand, we are created in God's image to be rulers and caretakers of creation. But on the other hand, as just a matter of fact, and we all know it, we all are stupid and naive, and we sin and we screw up and we live in death. That's the thing about human beings that is getting across in these first 3 chapters. That's the conundrum. Okay? Now, after Adam and Eve sin and God shows up, the first thing God does is he curses the serpent. The serpent is not Satan as we understand Satan today, but for all purposes, he's the evil one, okay? And God curses the serpent, and he basically says, I think it's in 3:15 or 3:16, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and the woman's offspring, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. What the heck does that mean? That basically is, right from the beginning, God promises that he is going to work through humanity, the woman's offspring, to somehow put an end to sin and death. Okay? Now the serpent's offspring, they're not lizard people. That's going to be humanity too. Okay? But here's the thing. God promises that he's going to work through humanity to save humanity, but there's going to be conflict within humanity. And that is what we see throughout the rest of Genesis 1 through 11 and Old Testament as well. So when they get banished from the garden, we are told in chapter 4 the story of Cain and Abel. And we know the story of Cain and Abel. Now here's the point. After Cain kills Abel, by doing that, Cain proves himself to essentially be the offspring of the serpent. And Seth, who takes the place of Abel, is going to be the offspring of the woman. Now obviously Cain literally comes from Eve. But for our purposes, this explains the genealogies. Because after that, in chapters 4 and 5, you have these huge genealogies. The purpose of them is to show this conflict within humanity. The woman's offspring and the serpent's offspring. That's why you have Cain's lineage and Seth's lineage. Okay? That comes to a head in chapter 6 with this odd story about the sons of God going into the daughters of men and them giving birth to Nephilim. We can't go into all that, but basically it's another odd story to show, to highlight the corruption of humanity. Human beings who are meant to be in God's image, to rule his creation, they end up, because of sin, doing the exact opposite. They oppress people. They take advantage of the daughters of men. And because of that, the entire creation is corrupted. Okay? So it begins with creation. Now we come, it seems it's a lost cause. So what does God do? The flood story in Genesis 6 through 8, really, is the story of Noah and the flood. Basically, you see that as a wiping the slate clean, bringing back the waters of chaos and starting over. Okay? Now, the flood story of Noah is very similar to the flood story in Gilgamesh. There's a huge difference, and this is one of the things. This is why you need to read it correctly. In Gilgamesh, and there's other flood stories like Artaxerxes. The reason for the gods bringing the flood is because humanity has just gotten too loud, and the gods can't get sleep, so they want to kill everybody. What does that tell you about the gods? By contrast, what you see here in Genesis 6 through 8 is the reason for the good God bringing the flood isn't because he can't get sleep. It's because humanity isn't just being loud, but humanity has become so corrupted and sinful beyond redemption that he has to start over. It's a justice thing. All right? Now, another thing you see in the file is a kind of a color-coded thing of the Noah story. We're not going to go over that, but what it shows is that source criticism that we talked about at one point about the J source, the E source. Some source critics, I think, go too far as they try to go through the Noah story and to pick out what parts are in what source. And it's very speculative, and I don't think you need to do that. I think you need to read the whole thing as a whole. Okay? But again, we don't have time to go into it. Here's what you need to know. That story is wiping the slate clean, going back to the original creation. And so what you have after that, in the rest of chapter 9, is kind of a starting over. Chapter 9, 1 through 17, Noah is kind of like Adam 2.0. They come off the ark, and God blesses Noah, gives him a command, gives him certain things to eat, but gives a prohibition, just like with Adam and Eve. So it sets up in the same way, but it's God starting over. And then after that, in 9 through 18 to 28, you have kind of a fall. Just like Adam and Eve, they were naked and were deceived, and that brings about sin and death. What Noah does is he gets drunk and he passes out naked in his tent, and Ham, the father of Canaan, comes in and looks upon his father's nakedness, which implies it's a euphemism for he's doing something naughty. Didn't just go like, whoops, I see you. He did something bad and then went out and told his brothers what he had done. So his brothers, Shem and Jephthah, go in and they cover Noah's nakedness just like God covered the nakedness of Adam and Eve. Okay? Now, when Noah wakes up, he curses Ham, he blesses Shem. Just like there's that division between Cain and Seth, now it's Ham and Shem. And then you get more genealogies. And again, the purpose of the genealogies is to show this war of the offspring unfolding. And what you notice if you look closely is all the bad people and the bad countries in the Old Testament that we will come across come from the line of Ham. Babylon, Assyria, Sodom, they're all mentioned. That's the bad offspring. By contrast, in the line of Shem, you have the Hebrews. And that sets up, that shows the purpose of Genesis 1 through 11, is to kind of lay out this war of the offspring, so to speak, and it kind of sets the stage for how to understand Old Testament history. Basically, God's going to work through the Hebrews, the woman's offspring, to bring about his plan to save his creation, and in order to do that, they're going to have to go to war with a lot of bad countries. Now anyway, so that's what's going on in Genesis 1 through 11. You have that figure, creation, separation, Nephilim, flood starting over, same thing. And the last thing with Genesis 1 through 11 is the Tower of Babel, which has correlation to the Nephilim story, where human beings try to set themselves up on the level of God, and God disperses them. Now here's the thing. By the end of chapter 11, by the end of the Tower of Babel story, well, God has already promised that he's not going to flood the waters again. Okay? So, what's God going to do? If he's not going to flood the waters again, what is he going to do? The answer is going to be... Sorry, my computer is updating and it's kind of irritating. Since he promises not to use the waters of a flood again, how is he going to bring about his purposes? The answer comes in Genesis 12. He's going to work through a specific person and his family, Abraham. And that sets us off into Genesis 12 through 50. Now, what you see in the files of the patriarchs, I give you, primarily just focus on the 3 charts I give you, because these aren't just random stories thrown together. What we see, let me get here. This is all my Genesis 1 through 11 stuff. What we see in the rest of Genesis is basically a cycle of three cycles. A story of Abraham, a story of Jacob, and then the story of Joseph. Now again, it's a lot of narrative, and what I'd like to show is how it all fits together as literature. And again, I can't go into it all in detail, but we can touch upon a couple of things. What you want to see, if you look at the Abraham chart that I made you all, let me find mine. A lot of it is purposefully, where is it? Here it is. A lot of it is purposely laid out. And I'm just going to really focus on the first bit from chapters 12 to 19. And they're color-coded so you can kind of see this. It's laid out in a very specific fashion, where there's 4 cycles, I guess you can say, where God meets Abraham, and then there's an episode where there's some kind of going away and coming back movement, and then there's an episode where there's some kind of division. Okay, so this is what I'll walk you through it really quick. In chapter 12, 1 through 9, this is where Yahweh, that's the Hebrew name for their God, Yahweh calls Abraham to leave his homeland and to go. And he would make him, he would bless them. Meeting of Yahweh and Abraham. After that, we're told of Abraham going, and then eventually going down into Egypt, where Pharaoh takes his wife, because Pharaoh thinks the wife is the sister. And then bad things happen, plagues happen, and then Pharaoh gives, and the Egyptians give Abraham and Sarah a lot of money to leave. And they come back to the Promised Land, Canaan. Now, right away you should think, well, that sounds a lot like the Exodus. Yeah, it is. It's a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the Exodus. But the point is, the movement is going off to Egypt, coming back. After that, you get in chapter 13, 2 through 13, the story of Abraham and Lot, his nephew, dividing the land. Lot takes the land on the other side of the Jordan near Sodom. Not a good choice. And Abraham takes what becomes Canaan. Okay? So what you see is a pattern. God meets with Abram, a going away, coming back, and then a division. That cycle repeats from chapter 13 and 14. God promises Abraham that he's going to give him the land. Okay? Then after that, in chapter 14, the scene shifts to Sodom, where Lot is taken captive. Lot and the people of Sodom are taken captive by raiders. And so what does Abraham do? He goes off. He saves his nephew Lot. He plunders the plunderers, and he comes back. So going away, coming back. And when he comes back, in the second half of chapter 14, he encounters Melchizedek, who is an interesting figure. His name means king of righteousness. We're told he's the king of Salem. And Abram gives him a tenth of all he has because he's due some kind of honor. The book of Hebrews elaborates on it, but for now, it's just some figure. And by contrast, when the king of Sodom wants to get his stuff back, or basically tries to make a deal with Abram basically rejects the king of Sodom. So again, there's a division between who the righteous and who the unrighteous are. Sorry, my nose itches. After that, starting in 15, you have another meeting of Yahweh and Abram. And at the very beginning, all of chapter 15 is very important. It's where God actually establishes his covenant with Abraham. Okay? And that covenant marks out the basic storyline of the rest of the Old Testament. And here it is in a nutshell. When he creates his covenant with Abraham, there's three things key. He says, I'll make your name great. I'll turn you into a great nation. And from that nation, all nations will be blessed. That's God's plan. Okay? He's going to work through Abraham to bring about a great nation, and through that all nations will be blessed. Now he elaborates on that, and actually throughout the rest of the Old Testament, you see that basic promise get built on as we go along, as you'll see. Now, the actual covenant ceremony seems really weird. It's where if you read chapter 15, Abraham takes some animals, cuts them in two, puts them on this side and that side. That sounds really weird, but in the ancient world, if you cut a covenant, it's literally make a covenant, cut a covenant with somebody, that's what they would do. They'd take some animals, they'd cut them in two, put them on each side with a little path in between, and then both parties would walk between the parts, and it was their way of saying, if I break my end of the bargain, if I break the covenant, my promise is that I am binding myself to in the covenant, may I be like these animals, okay? May I suffer death. But the unique thing in chapter 15 is that only Yahweh walks between the pieces. That's the burning torch and the fire pot. Abraham doesn't do that. And that's very significant, because what that means is that God is saying, I know you, Abraham, and your descendants are going to screw up a lot. You're going to break the covenant because you're human. I, though, am binding myself to these promises of the covenant. No matter what you do, I'm going to make good on it. Through your nation, through the nation that comes from you, I'm going to bless all nations. And I don't care how long it's going to take, it's going to happen. Okay? That's the significance of chapter 15. It's really important. After that, there's the story in chapter 16, because Abraham's been promised a son. Sarah says, I'm too old, take Hagar. And so Abraham says, okay, and Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. But because of that, Sarah then starts treating Hagar bad, and so once again we have a going away and coming back. Hagar runs away, and then eventually she comes back. And then in chapter 17, Abraham, as the sign of that covenant, he circumcises every male in his family, tribe, stuff. Once again, the purpose of circumcision is to divide who is in the family and who is out. Okay? After that, the fourth cycle happens. Chapter 18, God and two angels in the form of three visitors show up to meet Abraham, and they say, Ishmael isn't the heir that we're talking about. Your old wife Sarah is going to bear a child. And it's through that child of promise who God is going to do all this stuff. So again, a meeting with God. And then chapter 18 and through 19, you have, again, a going away and coming back movement where the angels are sent to Sodom to destroy it. It starts with Abraham talking with God about the destruction of Sodom. Then the scene shifts to the destruction of Sodom. And then at the end, the camera then pans back to Abraham the next day overlooking the destruction of Sodom. So once again, there's that movement. And after that, At the end of chapter 19, you get this odd story about Lot and his daughters. Because they've been saved from Sodom, they flee to the hills. And it's a really disturbing story where his daughters get him drunk and then sleep with their own father so they can get pregnant with their sons, who are then also their brothers. And that is the origin of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Okay? So, but that's how the story unfolds. It's not just random stories. There's a narrative to it. There's an arc to it. The only other thing in the rest of the Abraham cycle that I want to mention is in chapter 22, specifically the sacrifice of Isaac. This is a very important story because it shows that even though God has promised that it's going to be through Isaac that he's going to keep the covenant, he asks Abraham to kill Isaac, and Abraham has enough faith in God that somehow God's going to maybe raise Isaac up. Who knows? But the bottom line is, God doesn't want child sacrifice, but Abraham puts his faith in God enough to be counted as righteous. Okay. After that, we then get the Jacob cycle. The Abraham cycle takes you from chapter 12 up into chapter 25. Then we get Jacob, which takes you from 25 to 36. Now, if you look at the Jacob chart, here's what I want you to see. I want you to see a movement. The whole narrative has a certain movement. It begins with the birth of Jacob and Esau and that initial conflict. The very name, they're twins, but Jacob comes out second, grasping Esau's heel. The name Jacob means heel grabber, deceiver, and that is the perfect description of Jacob throughout this story. He is one conniving little guy. And there's a prophecy that the older will serve the younger. All right, so you can see the rest of 25 starts it out. That's the problem. The next column that takes you from 26, basically chapter 26, is you have some stories of Isaac and Abimelech having some conflicts within the land of Canaan. That's really all it is. It's just life going on in Canaan. Now, what it really picks up starting in 26:34 all the way into 28. This is where Jacob and Esau really conflict. And this is the story of where Jacob deceives Isaac for the blessing. He gets it, and when Esau finds out that he's lost out on the inheritance, he says, I'm going to kill Jacob. And Jacob ultimately decides to flee. So that column is the conflict. And so Jacob flees. And from 28:10 all the way to 29:30, this is the story of him fleeing. He flees Canaan, he stops at Bethel, and he has this vision of a ladder going up to heaven with angels going up and down. And it's very important to notice that it's at this point Jacob says, if the God of my father, if Yahweh brings me back to this land, then he will be my God. That tells you something, that at this point, Jacob isn't even a true worshiper of Yahweh yet. He's effectively pagan. Anyway, he flees. He goes back to Aram, his homeland, his family's homeland. He meets Rachel at a well, and he wants to get married to her. And old Uncle Laban deceives the deceiver by getting 14 years of labor out of Jacob and getting him to marry both of his daughters. So once again, deception is a key theme in the Jacob story. The very middle, which basically takes you at the end of chapter 29 all the way to almost the end of chapter 30, is just a list of one after the other, all the births that go on in Jacob's family. And that's going to give rise to the 12 tribes of Israel. After that, the arc starts to come back around. Now in chapter 30 and 31, Jacob and Laban start having problems. And Jacob deceives Laban in how they breed their flocks, and then eventually Jacob decides to leave and flee Laban to go back to Canaan. All right? There's other things you can kind of see here, but that's what's going on. After they get back to Canaan, whereas before Jacob and Esau, there was the conflict, now Jacob and Esau are going to be reunited, and resolution to that conflict in chapters 32 and 33. Jacob and Esau eventually make up. So then he settles back in the land. And then the last part in chapters 34 and 35 is they're back in Canaan, and a few episodes of what happened with Jacob and his family in Canaan. It's two interesting things. Chapter 34 is the story of Dinah. Here it is in a nutshell. The pagans of Shechem are living nearby. The prince of Shechem likes Dinah. He sleeps with Dinah. And then he and his father go to Jacob and his family and say, hey, we really like your daughter. Can we intermarry with each other? And Jacob's sons say, hey, we'd love to do that, but you're not one of us. You all got to get circumcised. And the people of Shechem, the men of Shechem, say, okay. So they all get circumcised. And then for those few days when they're all in pain from the circumcision, a couple of Jacob's sons go into Shechem and kill all the men. What does that tell you? They're deceptive just like their father, but also that they're really, really dangerous. Okay? Chapter 35, Jacob goes back to Bethel, where he had promised, the very place where he saw the ladder up into heaven, and the very place where he said, if God brings me back, then he will be my God. Well, what do they do in chapter 35? They go back to Bethel, they get rid of their pagan gods, and they become worshipers of Yahweh. Okay? So yeah. And then it ends from there. So you can kind of see the arc of the narrative going on in the Jacob cycle. Obviously, there's more things we can talk about, but if you understand the overarching narrative, hopefully if you read this on your own, you'll be able to appreciate some more stuff. One thing. Chapter 32, 22 to 31, where Jacob wrestles with the angel the night before he meets Esau. That's very significant. Because he won't let go of the angel until he gets a blessing, the angel blesses him and renames him Israel, which means he wrestles with God. But at the same time, he dislocates his hip. So Jacob, that very story is kind of interesting, that he gets a blessing from God, but he also gets injured. So kind of apropos for everybody, isn't it? After that, you get the story of Joseph. That takes you to the end of Genesis. Now, the only thing, everybody knows the story of Joseph. I'll just point out one thing. The story of Joseph begins in chapter 37. That's where his brothers sell him into slavery. Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, that whole thing. The weird thing is, in chapter 38, you have this weird story of Judah and Tamar that seems to have nothing to do with the Jacob cycle, with the Joseph story. Then after chapter 38, it goes back to Joseph, and then you get the rest of the story. What's the Judah story doing there? Here it is. In chapter 37, the person who suggests to sell Jacob to Egypt and thus deceive their father is Judah. Okay? He's a bad dude. And when he does that, and Jacob just falls apart, we are then told in chapter 38 that Judah kind of goes off and lives by himself, kind of away from his family. And if you read chapter 38, he does a lot of bad things. He has some sons, he marries them off to Tamar, but his sons keep on dying. But he's responsible for his daughter-in-law. But instead what he does is he ships her back to her father, tells her that, hey, when my youngest son is old enough, I'll marry you off to him. He is totally deceiving her. Doesn't plan on it. So her life is over. And then, so what she decides to do is dress up as a prostitute, disguise herself, and when Judah's wife dies, he goes to comfort himself by looking for a prostitute. There's Tamar, his daughter-in-law. She sleeps with her father-in-law to deceive him. And later on, a few months later, she's found to be pregnant. And so Judah says, oh, she's been unrighteous. Kill her. And at that point, she produces some of his effects, some of the stuff he left, and says, the man who impregnated me owns these. Do you recognize these? And at that point, Judah realizes what kind of guy he is. He kind of repents. That's important because the rest of the Joseph story from that point on, as you all know it probably, if you haven't, you could read it. By the end of the Joseph story, when Joseph is deceiving his brothers and saying that he's not going to let Benjamin go, the person who offers his own life for Benjamin's is Judah, the very guy who started the whole mess. And so it's kind of a redemption story of Judah. And then also, obviously by the end of the Joseph story, it's a story of how Abraham's family, Jacob's family, Joseph's family, makes its way to Egypt. And that's going to set the stage for the Exodus. All right, so there it is. The entire book of Genesis in a 30-minute or so video. Hopefully it'll make sense. There's so much more in Genesis that's worth reading, but you got to at least know the overarching narrative structure to it, and hopefully you get the idea of the main themes, and we'll go from there. Next video will be on Exodus, which will probably be maybe Exodus to Deuteronomy. We'll see how much I can fit in. All right, bye.